I want to talk about golf and how it relates to other types of sports or other types of venues that we create for activities. And in my mind, they're all related because they're all very constructed fields of play. They're objects and landscapes that we interact with. So the way that we set them up have a huge impact on the people who are interacting with them. Whether you're a professional or a new player or whatever it is, a new user, the overall experience that you have has a huge impact by the thing itself that you're interacting with. So, whether that's skiing or golf or skateboarding or climbing or tennis or whatever it is, I think the way that we talk about these different activities related to the objects and the fields of play have a lot in common. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. So, talking about the Masters, golf didn't start like the Caddyshack portrayal that, we often think of it today. It really started here in Scotland, which, on links courses, which were literally linking the sea to the towns that they were in. So it's, by most accounts, it started in St. Andrews in Scotland. And the course, even to this day, not only hosts the British Open or the Open Championship, but it also functions as a park for the town of St. Andrews every Sunday. It's literally a place where you can bring your family. To this day, your dogs, your family. It's not open for golf on Sunday. This is like having people go on the court at Wimbledon in a lot of ways. Like this is the best golf course in the world considered by many that is just open to the public. And the town in this image is just off to the right. And the course has to be a challenge to all abilities, every level. And this course, as much as any other, or maybe above all others, is considered the most successful version of this because look at how in this image the landforms are what is being used to create the contours that people are moving around. And it really is just the dunes that are separating the town from the sea. Like this is really just a routing that is using the existing landforms, and it certainly has been evolved over time, but it also has a sort of limited kind of artificial like interventions like these pot bunkers, which are just effectively like the bottom of a funnel. Like these things are relatively small, but their impact is huge. They collect water, they collect golf balls, they give people all sorts of fits. And back in the day, these courses were really, tended by sheep. This is actually an image of Central Park, which I think is fantastic, just sheep taking care of the grass. And so, my point is that golf started in a very different place than the sort of Caddyshack-ification of it, if you will. And so, talking about the architects who actually work on this stuff. So, when Alistair McKenzie came to Augusta in the 1920s to work on the golf course at Augusta that is now Augusta National, he was taking lessons from the old course, the one in St. Andrews, taking lessons from these links course and trying to take it and put it into an inland setting. And so the course was built in the late 1920s and opened in 1931 in the absolute heart of the Great Depression. And so there's a really great podcast I'll link to in the description that talks about him as an amateur economist because these golf course architects, like I'll get to in a minute, they were builders. They were not just people sitting in an office somewhere. These people are not idea people. These people have ideas that they make happen like literally in the dirt. So the actual, these are some early images. You can see how the bunker is very rough around the edges. There's limited numbers of bunkers. There's not a lot of deep rough. It's mostly like one cut of grass, and the landforms itself have been shaped to be the thing you have to navigate around. And these are all things that also have a lot of practical functionality like drainage and have to be very considered as far as, back in the day when they couldn't just move a bunch of land around like we can a lot easier now with bulldozers. But the point is that the design and the construction and the maintenance of it were critical to be considered at the beginning. Otherwise, it just wasn't going to last. So when you look at these early images or like this one, I like this one because you can see they're effectively building it and like kind of testing it as well. And whether or not this is a perfect matchup, this is now what it looks like more today, where these bunkers are much more pristine, but still, it's still this sort of flowing carpet of like generally one cut of grass. You can still see there have been additional lengths of cut introduced to different people's chagrin. But the point is that a lot of what made this such an incredible course that is related in sort of a different version, but learning from the old course in St. Andrews, a links course in a completely different setting. This way of taking an idea and moving it and deploying it somewhere else, we can absolutely do that. And I do that all the time. And I'm going to show you that in a second, because this way that we look at ideas, they are often an idea that isn't necessarily a shape or a form. It's an idea about how to go about doing something that can then be used in different areas or different aspects. And for that matter, in different times, different decades. So, now it's very different because these golf courses, this is a picture of Augusta, and, almost every year they rip large parts of it apart. Their greens are like highly constructed and like complicated drainage and, air systems. And the bunkers are like almost like pools. There are these lined bunkers, and it's a completely different thing. And a lot of people would argue it isn't necessarily for the better. It just is adding cost and maintenance and this and that. But my point is that as you look at the course over the years, it has changed a lot. So looking at Augusta over the last 30 years, from 1993 in this case, to a restored condition, you can see that there's, originally there's these trees. The sort of tree pattern has evolved, which basically limits the options from an A, B, and a C to an A option with a more limited approach to be had. And a more restored condition, meaning trying to bring it back to something like this, where you're opening it up off the tee so that you can attack the green from different angles. And why that matters is because depending on where the pin is located, it might be very difficult to get to it from different trajectories. So, for instance, hitting to a left pin from this side, you're not a lot of depth to go at it compared to from the opposite side, where you've got just a much bigger sort of like amount of depth that you can miss into, basically. So the shaping of the actual green and the location of the bunkers, and then the different locations for pins that they can use, over, say, the course of 4 days of a major tournament. That's why having these different options is so important, because depending on what combination of things you're going at, back left to from the front left, back right from the front right, these sort of crisscrossing attack angles and pin locations, it's a fixed playing surface of the golf course itself that you have a one movable object, meaning the pin itself, the flag, and then the player interacting with it. And that's why in my work, I think about this in very similar terms. So the buildings that I make are really about placing things and creating objects in a way that the way they relate to each other is more important than the thing itself. So when I'm going about sketching things, the idea that in my mind is about creating features or building parts in the way they relate to each other, in the way that people sort of navigate around them, in a very similar way, in my mind, to the way that landsforms are used, in the way McKinsey was following Augusta National, and like that sort of routing and using, what are you actually using to create the interaction for the user? And it shows up in these sketches. And in my world, when I'm making plans, it has to show up in the actual technical drawing. So the blockings and the sort of negative spaces around them and the view corridors and the paths that people have through and around these things, and the different sort of levels and how they interact and the sort of adventure and journey. Just like in a golf course, this is all fixed. None of this is moving. But you, as the user, are the thing that is dynamic and the thing that's moving around and through it. And again, these sort of sketches, just like McKinsey talks about the golf course taking lessons from other links courses, 100 years before him, in my world, if I make climbing walls, very often there's a direct relation or sort of inspiration about, in this case, it's not necessarily the shape, although there is certainly a connection. It's more the way that there's a flat surface and a curved surface, and the way they come together to create that sort of curving arret. Like there's something that you can use your words to describe, and that's what I'm trying to take from something like this. Is not the aesthetic of it necessarily. Yes, it's a beautiful South African Rocklands image of the incredibly difficult boulder problem, but more than that, like, what is it doing? And to me, that's when I go about making things like this, that's what I'm thinking about. And so that shows up in the sketches. It shows up in the modeling that I do when I'm putting projects together. It should show up in the way that you then add the handholds to them, just like placing a pin. You now can add the handholds to the surface of the climbing itself to create these different things that you can move on a weekly basis, whatever it is, daily basis, for whatever the situation is. And then the building itself is like moving around these things. So even just being able to have this view, just like a golf architect is looking at the landforms as a way to create opportunity and hide things and create corridors and like help you shape things. That's what these objects in the building layout in my world as a building architect are doing. They're doing the same thing, just in a different context for a completely different use. And so, in my world, if you're making a climbing gym, the pin is sort of the handholds, because these are the things along with these volumes that we can move around very easily. And there's a lot more sort of abstract examples of this. This is a sort of climbing feature in France. It's like a playground climbing wall thing that's just kind of bizarre and amazing. This is, an example of skate parks. This is a curated landscape. It's not a natural landscape, obviously, but these are things that people interact with. And, in skating, it's really interesting how people take features that may not have been intended for skateboarding and make it their own. And again, even in either case, the same thing is happening. You're taking a fixed object. In this case, it was made for skating. In this case, maybe not. But either way, you're taking your perspective as the user, as the one who's like playing with it and deciding what to do with it, inventing something new. And, over the years, we've seen different examples of this. This is a playground by Noguchi, and he made all these sort of landscape playground features that were pretty remarkable. And, they're a little bit abstract, but this idea that, Einstein calls play the greatest form of research. And, in Noguchi, who's very famous for architecture and furniture, he had this real obsession with playscapes. And, this is a Picasso sculpture in Chicago from 1967. And you can see the sort of banked floor of it that connects to the ground. And this is how it actually gets used day to day. And, you've got the kids and the skateboarders, and there's whole skateboarding videos made on just skateboarding on Picasso sculptures. And this is a sculpture in the Netherlands, which is really this sort of abstract landscape of people moving around it. And I think it's very similar to the way that a Noguchi playground sort of functions. This is just made for play. It's a little bit more explicit, but it also isn't too dissimilar from, say, racket sports or something like that, where these are all constructed landscapes. These are fields of play that the user interacts with and gets to invent within these boundaries. This is all about, sort of game theory has a big part of this, but the way that we use it, the way that we move around it, there's an invention within this fixed sort of structure. And, racetracks are another example. I bring this up because these change over time. So this is Silverstone. You can see the different colors over time. The track itself changes dramatically. First of all, it's built on a variety of sort of airstrips formerly that are now a world-class racetrack that has changed over time. Corners are added as technology changes. It's the same thing in golf. You see the sort of abstraction of the golf course in these lines and where the sort of fairways and bunkers and greens are, and how it changes over time. And so when you look at the people actually making these things, so this is Alistair McKinsey, back in the 1920s, 1930s. Notice how behind him the bunkers are a little bit more raw than Augusta is today. I don't even think this is Augusta, but regardless, you look at building architects and it's a much different vibe. This is Peter Zumthor, Rem Koolhaas, Nishizawa and Sejima of Sana. Some architects like to smile, which I always appreciate. When you look at golf course architects, it's a lot more pictures like this, people on bulldozers. This is Gil Hance. This is Pete Dye, one of the guys who really took advantage of this sort of heavy machinery, and him and his wife, Alice Dye, who, I think is only maybe now getting enough credit for what she did, but there's their dog, there's the machinery, they're in the dirt, they're making it happen. There's a lot of famous quotes from Pete Dye and people who worked with him, people like Tom Doak, who is currently a very famous architect. Pete Dye is passed, talking about how it became very clear working with Pete on the ground that he didn't need more ideas. What he needed was people who helped him make it happen. And that's the thing about golf course architecture that I love, because I always like to talk about how, I like to think sort of blue sky, but at the end of the day, I'm in the dirt slashing and burning. Like, we're making it happen. And that's the thing that I like about people like Pete Dye. And when McKinsey talks about the economics of golf courses, to me, they're so intrinsically connected that I don't understand how you can't think of it that way if your focus is making it happen. Most golf course architects are hired to actually build the course. Most building architects are hired to draw the building, not build the building. So again, I'm pointing out a sort of disjunction that the golf course architect inherently is focused on the end result, whereas the building architect, especially modern building architects, may not be as much focused. And they're definitely not as much of an expert in construction as they were, several hundred years ago. So I do think that we can't necessarily practice building architecture this way, but there are definitely some interesting parts of golf course architecture and the way they practice even today that we can learn from. And I definitely try to in my own work. His golf courses, in a lot of ways, I think became almost psychedelic in the way that they use landforms, just to continue that theme of thought here, landforms to create really interesting objects for people to move around. And so his course in Sawgrass, where they play the Players Championship down in Florida, these shapes are not natural edges. The corners that he draws here in the landscape, from a geometry point of view, it's a bunch of straight lines with very specific radius corners. So sort of straight lines that are connected by curves. So straight line and a curve. This is not a natural shape. Like, these are very sort of sharp curves, I like to call them, because it's a lot of actually relatively straight edges. And to me, this reminds me a lot of Enrique Morales, who's, a very well-known architect. And he was sort of known for this type of style of drawing. And these are just some more images of Pete Dye's work in Sawgrass. It really is, sort of psychedelic to me. And I love it because of that. It's embracing the fact that it's not natural. He's using the technology of his time to move around a little more land. Drainage and functionality of that is a huge issue. This is effectively a swamp where he's built this thing. And so the way that it's shaped and the curvature, he's making it his own vision, and this thing that you have limited options to move around, you move a pin around, and then the people using it, whether you're new or professional, have to really interact with this thing. And that's the same in skateboarding, in climbing, in skiing, in golf, in race car drive, whatever it is. To me, it's a lot of the same way of looking at it when you talk to the people who do it. So when we're watching the Masters this week, it didn't start like this. It didn't start like the Caddyshack portrayal. It didn't have the chairman up there talking and, a sort of questionable history of civil rights behind all of this not too long ago. It wasn't this sort of overly manicured golf course that, frankly, I still enjoy watching. It started like this. It was a much more rough, economical creation by people who cared about not spending too much on it, but had a vision and had a concern for how the thing operates. I would say the same thing about my work today, which is why I'm talking about this, because if you want to make it happen, just like these golf architects are in the dirt getting it done, that's the big lesson to me when I look at things like this. And so golf started here. It started in St. Andrews. It started with links courses, where the town itself is connected to the park of the golf course. And today, I still think it's connected in a lot of different ways, just like this. So, golf and skating and climbing, whether or not you think they're connected, I certainly do. So I hope that was interesting, and enjoy the Masters.